So it sounds, let me see if I can summarize what I'm hearing. It sounds like in the plan we need to clearly articulate that we are expanding the CCR options that will then affect whatever this weight actually is. Is that, Dr. McCormick, is that what I'm hearing?
I think we're reviewing that expansion.
Okay, we're reviewing that expansion, and that our current rate we're reviewing, and we're trying to identify other elements that we could potentially include. Yes.
Is it possible to the growth over time? Possible to also put a provision in on something that could possibly change? Could we say this is our trajectory and what we anticipate? However, we may revisit this in the event that X happens.
We've included caveats because of ISTEP, and I think that we can probably include language that explains that if this, we need to be, the piece we're getting from US Ed, which is a little conflicting, is we need to be as clear as we possibly can be. They want as many periods and not as many dashes or ellipses, and so we're trying to be as clear as we can, but I think in some places have to acknowledge that we're not where we want to be yet for a variety of items.
So for instance, as Steve Baker brought up, we can move that to 30%, just show a small increment with the language in that we're reviewing and there's the dual credit issue. We could do that.
I don't want to speak for the peer review process, and I think that I don't want to speak for what the U.S. Department of Education will respond to, but I think that addresses some of the concerns that we have in terms of the elements that we need to change to get to a place where we can do that. But I want to be clear that doesn't, I don't want to say this will pass peer review, no problem.
We have no idea.
We have no idea whether or not that will.
Patrick, would you repeat what you just said? Not the last part, but the sentence or two before.
Sure. So I think what we're looking, what I hear Dr. McCormick and other members of the board talking about is we do an incremental increase in the current plan from 25 to X%, and then articulate in the plan that we are looking at adding other elements to our college and career ready rate, but we will have to come back and revisit it in an amendment of some kind.
For the potential of pace of growth,
right,
based on something such.
Right. Right.
And this takes effect, whatever we recommend takes effect when?
So
what students will it affect?
So this will affect the fall of 18's grade, which means the data from 2017, 2018.
Okay.
But the impact is going to be minimal in 2017-18. We're talking about dual credit, though, correct?
We've not, yeah.
Well, as far as the credentialing issue,
yeah,
that will not impact, well, I say it won't impact us. The letter caused a lot of confusion. So regarding the decision, the ultimate decision, no, but the letter from Ivy Tech has caused some local concerns. But there shouldn't be that big of an impact during the 17-18. I know we have to muddle through some things. And really, potentially, or 18-19, I mean, we have a little bit of time as long as Ivy Tech, VU, which are our biggest partners with dual credit, continue to be great partners, which I don't have any reason to think they won't be.
Why couldn't it be 25, 25, 25, 30, 35? How long do we have to keep it where it's at in this plan? Does it have to go up immediately? Could we buy ourselves some time on the front end?
Buy as much time as you want, really.
Yeah, I mean, say, you know, our intent is to increase it, but we're going to give ourselves a couple of years at this rate and allow schools to adjust knowing it's coming. Plus, it gives us time to evaluate the kind of issues that, whether it's additions or potentially things that are no longer available.
Do we have to lay out what we're going to do year 2 and year 3? Can we just say that, hey, this is our number? and we're going to increase it. We don't have to say when we're going to increase it or what that increase is going to be or any time frame.
So
I want specifics.
they'll want as much specificity as we can provide them. I know that doesn't give you the exact answer of how much specificity, but I think we have to show the progress that we intend to make on this.
So the other goals with the 6 years, you're thinking we can maybe stick to what kind of a time frame within projection?
For the are you referring to the long-term goals?
Well, just so we can communicate the CCR changes. What's that time period do you think that they would need?
I don't know the peer review. I don't know the amendment process yet. The US Ed has said there will be an amendment process, but they've not been clear about how long that takes or what that will look like yet.
No, my question is, if we say we're 25, how many years do you think we need to project out with that trend data? Yeah, the other ones are 6 is why I'm asking.
Right, so all of our long-term goals go till 2023.
You just be consistent is what I'm asking.
Okay.
3 years at 25 and then start moving it up in year 4. That gives us plenty of time to make adjustments as necessary and for schools to adjust.
Okay. I don't know if that's going to pass peer review. Want to be very clear about that.
It gives us a point of negotiation.
Sure.
Yeah, because you could go to, in my view, if you got one in the end, you're better than where we were. And that lets schools know, to Leanne's point yesterday really resonated with me. School, even at this point, if something's changed, you have no way of affecting that for next year or putting that in place at this point. I mean, you do, but it's much tougher to put something in play for this coming year now, at this point where we are.
And then, like, what would it take for us to go back and amend that number? Let's say 2022 hits and we're making these increases and all of a sudden we have 2,000 teachers that can't teach dual credit anymore. Can we bring that number? Because if we're going to be moving in the direction of a higher number.
We're going to be making massive changes after I would assume after rulemaking. So it's going to be I know we have to send it in for amendments, it's not that easy, but yeah, we can definitely do exactly what you're saying.
We'll just have to be clear and cognizant of when the cliff is and start the process early enough so that we're able to amend it. But I, again, can't say what that process actually looks like right now. Okay, so let me see if I can summarize again, just so that I'm clear. We are saying that we're going to address the CCR rate over time, over a 6-year horizon. The number that was thrown out there was we would stay steady for 3 years at 25% and then increase the last 3 years to 30%, just as a straw man what Dr. Bertram put out there. But we would show that our intention is to increase our CCR rate while also going back and addressing what actually is in the CCR rate as well.
A lot depends on how that explanation is worded. Once you throw it, in my experiences, it doesn't make any difference what you're talking about, or the price of a new elementary building, or your capital projects number that you throw out there to the public. That's what's remembered. Mm-hmm. My caution is to throw numbers out there.
Right.
But I do encourage us to somehow verbalize or to explain in writing that it's our intent to, as we review the impact of dual credit concerns and CCR, that, somebody down there, I don't know if it was Byron, that said we're looking at other opportunities for CCR achievement to include, along with the 3 that we have, 3 or 4, whatever it is. So I think that's an important part. 25, and then just let them know that whatever year that is at 19, that we intend to address the concern of, or not the concern, but the issue of raising the CCR from 25 to some number.
Okay,
That's not the right way to say it, but,
sure. I think I know what you're saying.
okay.
Sounds like, just so we know, stay status quo for at least, I'm hearing some say 2, some say 3 years, and then start increments. That gives time for the field to adjust and time for some of this to play out.
I wouldn't say status quo. Say we are working on increase.
But as far as the number is the same, 25%.
But we're working on the whole CCR
Right,
issue.
right.
Correct,
The
I'm just
numbers
saying we're
plus
not
everything
changing
else,
the
so
number.
it's not staying status quo, we're growing.
The variable that we don't know is if we add other elements to the CCR rate, how will that impact
Exactly.
the breakdown of the grade? And so it's something that I think we'll have to pay attention to and revisit. Determine what are the elements you'd like to include in the CCR rate itself.
That gives us some good feedback. We'll go back and
Yep,
do some work on
absolutely.
that. Is the board comfortable with that, so we know where you are? Okay, perfect.
So we can move on to the growth table discussion. I'm going to switch to that slide and we'll allow Maggie to frame this. And we've got Dr. Keller here who can also help us talk about the math side of the growth table. So Maggie, all right.
What should we have in front of us right now?
Well, there was an additional packet that was provided yesterday with some scenarios of the grid look like this.
Scenario A at the top.
Scenario A on the top.
Got it.
And then in the appendix, it's pages 16 and 17. So I would start with page 16 in the appendix, because that is an outline of our current growth information. So what you see in the appendix there is distribution from the 2016 letter grades of what we saw on the growth domain or indicator specifically in the distribution there. So currently, as you can see, I may ask Cynthia to come up to kind of help with the growth table explanation a bit, just for those of you to have some better context into how the growth table works. Ultimately, when we calculate this indicator, each student is awarded a point value based on the type of growth or movement they saw from the prior year to the current year, and that point awarded is determined based on that growth to proficiency table. Students can show one of 3 types of movement: low movement, standard movement, or high movement under the table. And kind of the rule of thumb is that the standard movement is expected to be equivalent to about 1 year's worth of growth. So that's what we would expect to see from that student based on their prior year status. Low movement is kind of pretty much anything under that 1 year's worth of growth, or lower than the expectation, and the high movement is anything above what we would expect out of that student from the for that growth. So as you can see there, the distribution, we had total 72%, around 72% of schools received an A when we consider the kind of what we are terming an A+ category. Majority of our schools hit the A+ at 41%, or close to 42% of schools getting an A+ on our indicator, and then 30% of schools receiving an A. Our average growth score was 95 points out of 100 points for schools. So when we had schools calling and saying that they got a 90 on growth and they were excited, we kind of had to say, well, that's below average. So what we are bringing forth today is kind of sticking with this philosophical question of meaningfully differentiating and whether or not the growth table as it currently stands is yielding a meaningful differentiation of our schools. Some concerns that we've had from the department is whether or not this is, if there's a concern of masking achievement with the way that the growth table is generating scores. and also kind of if it's hiding those students who are not attaining the standard growth because of the inflated points awarded for either high movement or standard movement. So ultimately, the questions to ask here are looking at those points awarded in each of those columns and determining whether or not they make sense and whether or not they kind of align with policy goals. So if we look at the current growth to proficiency table on page 16 of the appendix, you can see that for the low movement, for the students who were in the prior year it did not pass, there are 0 points awarded for those students. And for any student who was a pass or pass plus, there are currently 50 points awarded. And again, the scale is out of 100, so anything above 100 is kind of a bonus for schools. Under the standard movement, we have 100 points for any pass or pass plus and 75 points for your did not pass making standard movement. And then under the high movement, we have 150 points awarded for your pass or pass plus students and 175 points for your did not pass students that make high movement. A little explanation on how this table was created, specifically focusing first on this low movement category. The assumption, the philosophy was, you know, with these pass or pass plus students, they may or may not still be attaining proficiency. So there was a philosophy that points should still be awarded, even though they weren't hitting the growth target or the standard growth movement for that year, which is why there's 50 points reflected there versus 0 for the did not pass, because those are students who are still not passing and they aren't making the expected growth that we would see for those students.
Would you say that again, please?
Sure. So the low movement points, as you can see, the pass and the pass plus categories are awarded 50 points. The philosophy behind that was that because they are still likely maintaining their pass or pass plus status and not dropping to did not pass, that there should still be points awarded there. That being said, we do see instances where they may drop, especially at your pass 1 category, where it's right on that threshold, where they may end up dropping down to did not pass in that year. So those were considerations, but ultimately the determination was made that some points should be awarded since they're still maintaining, for the most part, a pass or a proficiency, versus those did not pass students who aren't meeting the expectation of 1 year's worth of growth and are still not passing the assessment.
Before we get into the weeds, I'm a visual learner, and so I can see that chart. Does ESSA require us to have a chart that looks different than that? If the answer is no, then we're done. If the answer is yes, the chart should look differently, then we have some work to do. So I'd like to start just simply there. What does ESSA require the chart to look like?
So this goes back to that philosophical discussion of meaningful differentiation and what it means. They don't provide a definition of meaningful differentiation in ESSA. Again, in the regs, there was some further explanation, not much, but those have been repealed, so we don't have those to point to. I think it depends on who you ask, to be completely honest. There are some that say so long as they're not all in the highest category, it's fine. There are some who think that a equal distribution is what it should look like. I guess a personal opinion, I guess looking at this table, I would have some concern if I were looking at this and I saw that many, 72% of schools are hitting that, A or higher category.
So I think we need to do this in steps so we don't get into what we got into yesterday. So I would agree with you that most people would say that they should be equal, or there's some statisticians would argue it should be a bell curve, but that does not look like what it should look like. And so I just want to start simply there. Does anyone on the board think that that is an acceptable chart for meaningful distribution?
I have no confidence that this metric tells us anything. Anytime that you have a scoring formula where 95 out of 100 is the average, that's absurdly high. And I mean, I'm just not, this is meaningless. So I think that absolutely has to be changed.
So if we're at the point of saying it should be changed, then maybe we can get up to the point of what it should look like. What we do with the data in the weeds and the details, we can massage this in different kinds of ways and make the chart look like we want it to look. But until we agree on what the chart should look like, we're just wasting our time playing with these numbers. So I would argue maybe we should talk about what this chart should look like. I think no one spoke up. I'm not sure if that's an indication that people are still thinking. But if we think this is not the right distribution, then what would it be? Again, statisticians would say it should be a bell curve of some kind.
Well, David, I would disagree with
that.
you on one point, that we should talk about what the scoring looks like, how you come to this conclusion. I don't care what the chart looks like, but we need to talk about that scoring and the way that stuff's weighted.
You're saying that you're not happy with that
the
chart.
formula stinks.
I'm in agreement with you, but what would it look like if we had the ideal chart?
One additional point that I want to make, since I expressed a personal opinion, is that if you were to look at this and you look at the achievement chart is essentially the inverse of this. And I think that that's a question that we need to consider as well, is that there should be some sort of correlation or linkage between your achievement and your growth. And if you're seeing the complete opposite on your achievement side, is this metric as it currently stands actually showing us what it should be showing or demonstrating what we're seeing in schools?
One thing I'm struck by, though, is if we look at where we stand today, and if in this distribution, it doesn't reflect at all where we've come from. Improvements that have been made over time. Even though the law changed, the accountability is extended and a new packaged differently, our schools have also made a lot of progress in a lot of areas. So we're taking this as a single point to say, here's where we're at today. Now we're going to redistribute the schools, essentially, or is that not the perspective? It goes back to the point that was made, is that we're raising the bar again, right? Here's where we're at to this point. Now we're going to raise the bar, essentially, which then redistributes schools and puts them in. Is that more of an accurate statement? Latter part of that.
So here's why we're seeing what we're seeing here. So we have a scale of 0 to 100 points, but the table allows for up to 175 points to be earned. And, half of the table awards 100 or more points. The other half awards 75 or less. So ultimately what you're seeing is you're getting so many students that are getting this bonus, and it's inflating it to the point of the A's being 72%, and you're seeing schools excelling or exceeding the A threshold of 90 to 100 because of those extra additional points.
Got it. All right, that's helpful.
As Maggie's indicating, scale, quite honestly, of 90 to 100 probably isn't appropriate for this. I would argue that given the philosophy behind how the scale was, or the chart, the growth, the way the points are awarded, how it was developed, the baseline is 100. You want kids, at the very minimum, passing the test and attaining a year's growth. And that translates into 100 points. That's the philosophy, and I apologize if I'm getting into the weeds, but that's the philosophy, that schools should be not averaging 95, they should be averaging 100 points. It's set up that way. All kids who are passing get 100 points. Kids who are not passing, kids who are in low growth but passing, kids who are in high growth but passing, that averages to 100. That's 50 plus 150, it averages to 100. So the goal is that you get 100. But there was another goal in that for students who are not passing but making high growth, within 3 years, they will be passing. So to incentivize that, the students who are not passing but making high growth, many additional points were given there. And therefore, we end up with this chart that really doesn't translate into a scale of 90 to 100 is an A. So that's part of the problem that we're dealing with.
Really, in theory, the impact of this for 8 is the impact of CCR for high school. So the impact we're seeing in this for 4 through 8 is the same impact we're seeing for CCR for high school. We just left high school alone. So before we go after and destroy 4-8, just keep in mind that same principle, same accountability, same weight, we'll get to that, but we just left CCR alone with the same impact. So this, just something to think about.
Isn't CCR different in that we don't have the information yet? Right, we have, well, maybe I'm not following you. The panel is going to meet and they're going to put in grades.
The current CCR data that, I don't know if we can go back to that slide, that we just hashed out where it showed that inflation at 25%.
Right.
That impact and accountability is the same impact that growth has for 8. That CCR is having that same impact on high school. Does that make better sense?
Okay, now.
So I'm just saying, we left it alone for high school. I just want to bring that out because it is very valid.
I would, instead of arguing for trying to get to a bell curve or what the weights should be, I guess I would hope that the board would consider the philosophy behind how the points were awarded in the growth chart, and if the points need to be adjusted per the philosophy, it still comes down to this idea of the goal was 100 means you are on track and staying on track. That was the philosophy behind. And if we need to adjust within the chart to get a better differentiation, if you will, of the schools, then look at what the chart means. Think about what the chart means, indicates, again, but going back to this main philosophy of 100 points means you're on track and staying on track. Because when we looked at the former growth model, it ignored all students who were on track and staying on track. It only either awarded points for high growth or schools got dinged for low growth. It ignored our majority of our students, which are on track and staying on track.
So 100 points should be a C. How long have we been, I'm afraid to ask this question. How long have we been computing 90 to 100 as an A?
Oh, 90 to 100 as an A? Forever and a day?
Centuries.
Well, so we switched to.
No, I'm talking about with this formula.
So, the new accountability system, the first official year was 15-16, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So the first official year on the new accountability system, which is on a 0 to 100 point scale, started in 15-16. Prior to that, we were on a 4-point scale. This growth model, similarly, first year that we utilized it for accountability purposes was for 15.
So we've only calculated 1 year's grades using this?
We've only done official grades with M1. We did a trial run with 14-15 data to show so schools could see what their grades would look like. So we ran growth on the 14-15 data, and we saw the similar distribution.
Cynthia, since you're proposing this, and if we were to adopt that, how would the chart look different based on your proposal?
I've sent some models to Maggie that she's run, and I've sent some additional models where I'm sort of scenario.
It's in your packet, the scenario A packet.
Yeah, and those were the
So that's scenario A. If we were to adopt your proposal, that's what the chart
I'm not
would look
saying
like.
I'm landing on anything yet. I'm still,
I'm just asking.
That scenario A is one of my proposals.
So
My initials.
is this the chart that would be a result of implementing your suggestion?
I'm not making any suggestions yet. I'm still playing. I'm still digging. I'm still researching. I've sent her
Well,
6 additional
we've got to
that I
make a
haven't seen
decision,
yet. I
and
understand,
we got to
but I've
stop
sent
people
her-
from playing and provide good information, so.
I've sent her 6 additional she's not been able to run yet because I only just saw these the other day. So I haven't had a chance to dig into, I don't have a proposal for you yet.
Okay, so we're sitting here in a work group and we're supposed to be making decisions, but we don't have the data to support decisions that we're considering, which is problematic. So in any case, so do you have an option A, B, C, or D, or what are you proposing?
So-
Or are you just dumping it on us?
Well, it's a policy call.
A policy call, but we need recommendations
So
from DOE.
what you have in the packet and in the additional are some options that we've considered. So as Cynthia mentioned, everything is looking at the points values awarded and looking at adjusting those while also maintaining policy calls that were initially part of the development of this table. So
Okay.
all
Is
of
this it?
these, yep, so if you look at that packet, those are different approaches of ways that you could maintain the policy of the initial table and the direction that that was initially developed, while also trying to control for the kind of inflation, I suppose.
Okay, so thanks for doing that. Can you just explain each one so that we can make a decision? These are just the data in a graph. There's no explanation on how you got there. I think that's important to
Yeah,
understand.
absolutely. So Maggie's going to go through those scenarios. I just wanted to offer a couple of questions for your consideration. So what you have now is an accountability system that's essentially saying everyone's growing, but people aren't achieving.
Right,
Okay? Probably not.
Right, problematic.
What we want to have, right? Also, the way the math is currently working is that you can have 4 kids get 175 points and cover 3 kids who get 0
Yeah.
points.
right. Mask the results.
Right, so the question I'm saying is, what is the premium that you want to award for high growth? Because I think everyone is in agreement that there should be some premium for high growth because that represents extraordinary effort at the school level, right? So I just wanted to throw those out there as sort of thought options for you as you figure out where we're going here. But these 4 scenarios sort of adjust the sliders on those things, on those 2 dimensions, so.
But it doesn't address the underlying formula, these scenario recommendations.
Well, as you see in the packet, you'll see that it actually does because you'll see a difference in kind of the distribution of the letter grades.
Right. So how did you get to A? Again, we have numbers and just the chart. How were those calculated without going too far in the weeds?
So on scenario A, I think the biggest things that you're going to see here are a change. If we look, let's start on the low movement category, okay, and we'll work our way over. So if we look there, there's a decrease in the amount of points awarded for your pass and your
So I
pass
think what would
plus.
help is our original weights are on page 16,
Right.
so that you can see the comparison on the chart, because I know that gets confusing. So if you look at the comparison, the value to the points awarded has changed.
16. Okay, back here. Here.
Can I ask a few questions while we're thinking? What test does this chart represent?
This is off of the 2016 and 2015 I-STEP comparison.
When did the test change?
2015 was the first year of the new assessment.
So this
All on.
chart represents the new test.
Yep.
Okay, that helps. Cynthia, I seem to reflect that you were in attendance to a lot of these meetings that we went through developing this. I was part of the development of this.
Yes, I was there.
And what we felt was important, and I just want to reiterate what you have covered, Cynthia, and you did a nice job of reflecting what the committee went through. What we wanted to recognize was work and effort from teachers and students, even if they stayed in the same category and got a year's worth of growth, but maybe didn't not pass 3 or 1 to did not pass 2, but they still got some credit if they stayed in that category but showed 9 months worth of growth for that period of time. We thought that was important, that teachers and students and parents see that the kids did work. And also thought it important that we were able to show if they moved up categories. So I want to make sure that the board understands that it was recognizing and acknowledging efforts in improvement, academic improvement by students from year to year.
Correct.
Okay. So this is a reflection, the chart on page 16, which is probably what's up there, is a reflection of the first year of the test change.
From 15 to 16, it's growth from the
I
very
have trouble
first
keeping that straight in my head, so you have to forgive
it
me for
is
that.
growth from the administration of the first assessment. So,
First assessment of the test that was changed, that was made more difficult.
right, the test changed. The first administration in 15 was fraught with some concerns, as you may remember. In 16, things stabilized somewhat, but it's still only year 2 of the assessment under a new vendor. The test is, per our experts who helped advise us on developing this, Dr. Bedebenner and Dr. Briggs,
Yes.
both recommended that, quite honestly, the test isn't even stable for 4 years. So they said, it's not a stable assessment, and we changed vendors. So we're looking at results that are sort of concerning.
That's exactly where I was going, was we changed vendors, changed tests.
Right.
And it takes, I think, maybe even Dr. Benebetter said we could count on 3 years of data, but he'd like to see 4.
Right, and the change in vendor sort of makes us more confident in 4 than 3, because the change in vendor affected the stability of the assessment.
I feel something that Superintendent McCormick said earlier really resonated with me again, is the whole idea of this is like the CCR piece that we just went through. And I feel like we're trying to make a change here to make a graph look like it's supposed to look. Let's call that what it is. And that we can say that's part of the game or whatever, but I'm having a real problem with playing a game on that. So I think that we take the same approach personally, and I appreciate the rest of comments on this. I think we need to take the exact same approach we took with CCR. We need to hold it. We have a whole new testing and assessment program coming 18-19. I appreciate Steve saying he has trouble keeping track, because I do too. But that in and of itself is a reason to take a little more of a long-term approach to this as opposed to a short-term approach. So I would propose that we take the same approach, we keep it the same, and then we however we word that, I'll leave that to the people that can word that, of how we then look at this, because as Dr. Freitas just said, we don't really have the real stuff analyzed yet, right. I don't think, to look at for that. So however we put that together so that we get this right, because I think the other thing that Dr. Keller said that resonated, everybody's resonating with me today. I'm coming away from here so much wiser. But the other thing, as he said, growth is up here. We have an inverted look from growth to proficiency, right?
Right.
Well, I have another problem with just changing the graphs to make that look like it's supposed. We've got a problem somewhere else. There's some other root causes here, maybe.
Think so?
Right.
Right. So there's some other root causes in here that I don't think that there's enough hours in today's day to get that figured out. So I would like for us to take the exact same approach we took with the other, knowing that at some point we're going to need to lock ourselves in rooms for 3 years and figure this out. And I think it goes back, and the other point that I want to make with this, because I think it's important, because this came out in the ISTEP panel and somebody just referenced this. you have to have some time. That's where, that was really talked about in that panel. We have got to stick with something for long enough for it to work and for us to see, to be able to manipulate and look at this data to really have some answers. So sorry, I went off on a little tangent there, but I think we got to take the same approach and not just pick a way to make a graph look the way it's supposed to.
The scoring of the CCR made sense, with what we were doing with the time. Independent of the ESSA plan, the scoring here doesn't make sense. So I think it's different.
Walk me through how you think it's different.
The fact that, I'm going to sort of what Cynthia's saying, that 100 is sort of the baseline.
Oh, you
but
have a
yet-
problem with the scale.
Correct, yeah.
What about the concept is what I'm after. Do you understand the concept is exactly the same?
Absolutely, and somehow in 2015, when they changed it, because I know this isn't what was originally discussed as to how a growth model was done, but apparently they changed the cuts on it to make it appear as though more schools were actually getting A's. And I mean, I don't know what all went into that, but this doesn't seem to really tell us anything now. And maybe even at the level of the actual scoring and weighting in the formula doesn't make sense. So I'm thinking, maybe that even needs to be opened up. But clearly, I would be almost embarrassed to send that out.
Well, there is some argument for holding courses, Dr. Ernest was saying, until the new assessment is in place, and then we reevaluate everything. The chart for calculating the growth points has to be approved by the board. I mean, it's not even actually in the rule. It's right now it's left out of because it shifts every year, and every year it comes back. The target ranges have to shift every year until we get a stable test, which is about to change again. So I think once the assessment changes again, we obviously need to do the deep dive into it, just like we did a massive deep dive when we came up with this. We looked at not 4 charts or 6 charts. We looked at, 30, 50, whatever it was.
32.
Quite a stack.
It's 32.
Yeah, quite a stack of charts to figure out what was best for our state and our students. And so with the new assessment, we're going to have to do that again. But obviously, this is your decision.
John?
Question before the board is, where do you want to go with growth? Because when we get a new test, then the same argument can be made that it's not a stable test, right? And then we have, now you're 6 years out. So again, it's really a decision for the board. Where do you want to put the premium for high growth? And how do you want to sort of true up the notion of schools that grow but don't achieve? Right? Because I think that's kind of what you're getting at, right? If we have schools that grow but don't achieve, or if there's some kind of connection there, is it really as it needs to be?
So coming back to Byron's comment, given that schools have no idea under 17-18 there would be this change, considering there'll be a new test in 18-19, is this board comfortable with saying during 17-18 pretty much, I know Vince doesn't like the word status quo, but staying with what it is, knowing we are going to have to review all this information, and again, the plan can change, and we would have to write that out in a narrative explaining we're not comfortable with the growth and go into where we want to go with things, or we could even define that, like keep it the same for 17-18, and then we want to move toward whether it's scenario A weights, whatever it may be.
Something that I don't understand as well as I would like to is there some modification that we could make to the point system that would begin to dilute the inflation of performance in a way that gets us closer to a truer measure, but doesn't completely throw a grenade in the room? That's the thing that I don't understand.
Performance or growth chart?
For the growth chart. For the growth chart, because I think that is so kind of like the CCR analysis where there's so many other things swirling around that we can't control that it makes it difficult. I don't understand that.
And I think we're all on the same page. I think we're
Yes.
saying the same language
Yeah.
from Byron to you for my comments as far as treated exactly what we just treated the CCR, knowing we're going to have to make changes and we want it to be rigorous. Obviously, this is out of whack, but there's also something on the performance side we can't ignore if we tackle this. We're going to have to look at all provisions of it. So to handle this in isolation is going to cause a whole other problem. So if we handle it the same way as CCR, knowing new tests coming, preparing the field, that we would stay with this for 17, 18, knowing we're going to have make changes in from here on out. But what those look like right now is very difficult, given so many of the unknowns. And I say we don't use the excuse of, we got to wait 4 years out. And I get that, Cynthia, I don't think that's an excuse, but I understand that's a valid, I mean, in your world, I get why you said that. But I think for the field, we can't kick the can 4 years down the road.
So we believe in our ESSA, we can just state that the state board has the authority every year to look at the table, and on a yearly basis, you're making decisions based on that table, and that would give you the authority to make adaptations as you need to, but then we can keep it, if you want to keep it as is right now, that's how we could address it in the plan.
And really the positive piece of this is if we didn't have ESSA, we wouldn't be having this discussion, probably to this degree.
So I have a question for Patrick. So you're coordinating the writing of this plan, and is it your intent to submit this chart in the plan and justify it that it's meaningful differentiation?
The answer is no. We wouldn't put the chart in.
Why not? If the argument is we're going to kick the can down the road till all these other things happen and so forth, why not put the chart in? And same thing with CCR. I mean, if we're so confident that this is the right argument, why don't we just put it all in and share it?
If the board wishes for us to put the chart in, we put the chart in.
I think obviously I don't agree with what's being proposed, because in every state things are changing. It's in flux. And so if the argument is there's a lot of things changing, we're going to kick the can down the road, I'm okay with that if that's the will of the board, because I know if it does get kicked back, we'll have another opportunity. So it's not a high stakes assessment by U.S. Department of Ed. It's not either we get it or we don't. So there's an opportunity to go back and forth. But I would like to see the charts that justify our argument for meaningful differentiation there. The other thing the ESSA requires is that we have a definition, our own definition of meaningful differentiation. So I'd like to know what our definition is going to be in the report.
So my question is, if you're not comfortable with where we are now, what would you propose?
Yeah, what I would propose is where we were headed before we got off on another tangent, which I had asked to look at scenario A. Scenario A, if you have it, I'd like to put it up, but this looks more like a distribution of some kind. And so, I mean, I'm not pushing it as one member. If other people disagree, that's fine. But if we're going to submit that, we need to include charts. We need to have a definition of meaningful differentiation. And I'm asking, what is going to be our definition of meaningful differentiation?
So before we address the definition, what I would say is if the board wants to be able to have control and not change that chart, you know that any peer reviewer that's reviewing that chart will highly likely will send it back to the board. So if we include it, then we need to be prepared to send it back. And so that's why, you know, making those decisions, if the board wants to be able to try to control it more, that's why you would not include it. If you want to have them come back at us, that's when we would probably include it.
Some of that may be determined by the explanation that's put forth and attached to the chart to make sense. When we throw out names like, was it Briggs, Dr. Briggs and Dr. Bedebenner, those folks carry a lot of weight across the country. And that's the reason we used them, and that's the reason we had them attend our meetings and advise us as we worked through this. And I specifically remember Dr. Bedebenner, I asked him the question, is this, when we got to this point, is this perfect? And he said, absolutely not. And I said, given the constraints that we have, is this the best we can do? And he said, absolutely.
I would say that if we can get actually some quotes from them to include in our ESSA plan, that would help us.
Yeah, my point is just to be transparent and provide all the information. I'm not, going beyond that. I just think that if we're proud to submit a document that makes the case that this is meaningful differentiation, or we can't do it because there's too many moving parts, which happens in every state, then let's be proud and submit all the information. So I'll go back to my question. What's our definition then of meaningful differentiation?
Sorry, I'm so sorry. I was trying to.
That's okay. So they require us to have a definition, statewide definition of meaningful differentiation. So given what we're submitting, I'm asking the question, how do we define it, given the direction we're going in?
The decision of what is the definition of annual meaningful differentiation is a policy call, which is why we came with sort of the outline of the scope of possibility and we needed your input because it is a decision that the board has to make.
I understand that procedurally, but I'm asking a specific question. What are we putting in the plan for the definition of meaningful differentiation? The peer reviewers at U.S. Department of Ed is going to be looking for a definition. So given what we've agreed to, what is going to be our definition?
Well, in terms of that, David, from what I've heard so far from the presentations, it seems to me like we're putting too much emphasis on distribution. I think distribution can be a component of meaningful differentiation, but it doesn't have to be the main differentiating indicator. That being said, I'm very uncomfortable submitting a plan that in two of the major academic indicators, we're basically saying, we know we aren't differentiated and we're not going to be differentiated for the next 2 or 3 years, but we're working on it. I think that definitely comes back. It's an unsavory media event when it comes back, when they reject your state plan, looks poorly upon us, looks poorly upon the state. And I think we should be a little more concerned about just sending it up there and letting them say, yeah, no, you're rejected.
If we are, though, trying to be thought leaders in terms of how we're approaching some of these very nuanced challenges, I wonder, is there a way that we include in the narrative or somehow the way that we frame our response of understanding what it means to do this meaningful differentiation work, sort of the continuum of study that we're trying to do around, so the CCR analysis, right, and how we're really being thoughtful about how those pieces need to align in the same analysis, because it's a system. I mean, they do all touch each other, and to the point of wanting to make certain that we don't start pulling threads out of one part of the tapestry without really understanding how it's going to affect the entire piece, I think is wise to go through it, as long as we are articulating and we hold hands and say, this is work we're committing to doing, and we're doing it in this thoughtful way, and we want to make sure we fully understand the impact of all these decisions, because they do hit in 17, 18, and we need to make sure that schools are prepared to move under that. So I guess I'm wondering, is part of what we're doing too, weaving the narrative with being transparent about where we are today, that it's not acceptable, that we are going to move it, that these are the things we are going to do, and not wanting to throw something up or do something without giving it the study that it requires. That's where I hear the consensus. I don't know what others think about that, but it's not saying that where we are is okay.
But when we, you need to respond to her.
They need you to go to the mic. Thank you.
I don't know if other states are actually defining meaningful differentiation, or they're defining it de facto by the measures that they're proposing. They're defining it or de facto. Okay. Anyway, one idea is to have the board say something like, as a target of meaningful differentiation, having no more than 30%. I mean, having no more than 70% achieving the top category at the inception of so sort of saying this, having a range, say, well, we're not trying to get a bell, we're not trying to get a flat distribution, we're just saying that if 100% of the people are already achieving it, we probably need a new policy goal. back that down, where is the board comfortable? Is it 80%, 75%? And then sort of use that as a profile for thinking through other measurements. That way we're not kind of inordinately like focusing on what the shape of a chart needs to look like. Well, at a policy level, we're trying to have a little bit of a spread where at least 30% of our schools are not in the top category. I mean, I'm not throwing out 30% as the number that you should do. I'm just saying might be one way to kind of jump past, oh, what should the chart look like?
So I really like that. So maybe that'll help us be productive. So on the A level, schools that receive A, what percentage should receive an A score? Is it 100%? Is it 0%? Is it 70? What do we think? What percentage of schools in Indiana should get an A grade?
I guess my response to that is all the schools who earned that based upon the scale that they were given and know and understand. Another follow-up question is, so we throw a scenario A through, you name it, D, one of those in, what does that mean to the schools currently and next year?
So I guess we heard from two people. I'd like to hear from other people. What percentage of schools in Indiana, state superintendent, should receive an A?
Yeah, so I wouldn't put a percentage on it, respectfully, John. I mean, I'm uncomfortable with that because I think if we tell schools even go into AP, if we say only 30% of your kids can hit that 3 or better, you're capping achievement. So you're playing a game where you are you're forcing numbers to hit a graph or to hit, I understand, I mean, it's a good thought process. I feel really uncomfortable with putting a percentage of how many can be an A. What if there are 40 that are legitimately A's and we've forced them into another letter? Because I'm a little uncomfortable with that. It goes back to even in a classroom, you don't say only 30% of your kids are going to get an A. Well, you may have 70% of your kids get an A if you're sitting in AP Chem. So I'm a little uncomfortable forcing a percentage for a distribution. I'm just a little uncomfortable with it. I understand it and I get what you're saying, but I'm a little uncomfortable. And I know not 30%, so you're not hung up on that. So, but even
thinking more at the component level, some states do force a norm curve on, which is sort of the basis of your question. But I also think there's a discussion that happened yesterday where if you say all kids have to hit this mark and it's theoretically possible that they all hit the mark, then when they do, then it's time to, probably a new policy goal. Mm-hmm. So I don't think this is so much a conversation about a norm distribution that we're searching for, or that if suddenly we have 71% of schools achieving the highest goal, that we have to refactor everything. It's more of a dotted line kind of in our conversation. That was what I was proposing to say. If our distribution is so skewed that north of 70% are already, or 80% or whatever you say the threshold is, we probably need to do some refactoring there. That's all I'm saying.
So you're talking more of a starting point around a number that would have some standard deviation around it. So we're not pinpointing what percentage.
Right, I'm saying if you put a kind of a dotted line there, that might help the feds to sort of know generally where we're going. That sort of gives a backdrop to some of this, hey, we're going to sort of stay the course. But as some of these other things become more clear, this is something that's in our mind about meaningful differentiation.
It's really created on a projection versus on a cap.
Right.
That's a very different conversation.
I would not be suggesting a cap or anything like that. It's more of a, here are the targets that we're sort of shooting for when we have charts like this.
Yeah, I understand.
So I'm just trying to cut to the point because I think there's philosophical differences on this, and it's historical. You get with any group of people, there will be this kind of discussion. And the way the federal government defines it, I believe, the meaningful differentiation is they're looking for some kind of distribution among the 5 categories. And if we don't believe that philosophically, again, to be transparent, maybe we just need to report that and say we don't agree with that requirement. And in that we don't agree with it, in a traditional view, we're going to create our own definition. which includes something that Dr. Heller was just talking about, that maybe we look at it not in a traditional sense, but in a new way. And then submit that and see what happens, because it's really non-productive behavior for us to argue the philosophical part in the weeds. And that's, I think, what we did yesterday. We got into the weeds and tried to solve the philosophical differences by beating up on some of these charts and so forth. So I sort of like the argument that Dr. Heller makes, and I think this is what he said. In the traditional view of the federal government, we're philosophically opposed to that. And therefore, we're going to approach it in a different way, and this is how we're going to do it, by projecting out where we're headed. Did I capture that in order for us to move forward, or is...
This is year one? This is year one of this test? Sorry, can you repeat the question?
First year that will be on iLearn is 18-19.
No, the current.
Oh.
This chart is year one of the
Yes.
revised iStep.
Yes. All of the data is from 2016, so.
And once again, Dr. Benner said, minimum of 3 years of data to be, what's the word I'm looking for? Stabilized, preferably 4. And we're trying to manipulate or adjust, I shouldn't say manipulate, adjust the numbers to get a graph that we're comfortable with after 1 year of experience. And the national expert says 3 or 4 years.
The stability is in regard to the target ranges that you see on the table. So what the range is to demonstrate low movement, standard movement, or high movement. And I think what is generating what you're seeing there are the point values that are awarded to the low movement, the standard movement, or the high movement. I think we've seen it, we saw it with the demo 14-15 data, and then with the 15-16 data, that we see a fairly similar distribution in both years. So I think where we are currently, and that was really, I think, this will be year 3, right? So what we see this year, if we see something similar, then I would probably say there's some concern to be had with what we're seeing with the table.
I'd just like to provide an alternative definition to what David's suggesting, and suggest that I think what they're looking for is multiple factors of growth. They want to see that we're looking at multiple factors of growth as in differentiation, not that we're just using test scores or using one thing. And I think we can establish multiple meaningful differentiation by showing that we're using multiple factors in evaluation. And I don't think it just comes down to the distribution at all.
Trying to digest what you just said, and such as, multiple factors such as.
I mean, things that we've already talked about that may for other reasons be problematic. So I went through a whole period of trying to get someone to come up with something that worked on the statewide level that didn't exclude small districts. So I really don't know. I mean, what that is, I can't really answer, but someone threw out internships, but other things other than just test scores and test scores. So I think if there were other factors that we could identify that could be implemented statewide to evaluate growth, it would provide differentiation.
Patrick, does ESSA ask for standardized test assessments and grades, not grades, but assessments such as what we see here?
Yes, so for the academic achievement and academic progress section, it requires a standardized test in grades 3, standardized assessment in grades 3 through 8, and at least once in high school.
So you said academic achievement and...
Yes, so academic achievement is equivalent to what we say proficiency is. Academic progress is growth. I'm just using the ESSA definitions.
Okay. So they kind of define for us what we have to put together and present.
For this indicator, yes.
Okay, thanks.
But it doesn't have to just be that. You have to have testing, the test scores, but it doesn't have to be solely test scores, right?
For the indicator we're talking about.
For the growth indicator.
It has to be test scores.
Just
It has
test
to be
scores?
assessments for the growth factor, yes.
Okay, only test scores.
For the growth
Okay.
factor, yes. So I don't know if I can try and summarize a consensus because I don't think that we've reached one yet.
Good luck with that.
Can someone explain scenario A? I still don't really understand scenario A.
Oh, you sure can.
Maybe. So in scenario A, I adjusted the scales. Essentially, I left the standard movement in the growth, the way the points are awarded, I left that the same. Going back to our philosophy that 100 points, if you're on track and you're staying on track, you continue to get full credit. And if you're not passing, that's where the 75 comes in. If you're not passing, but you grow by a year, you're not getting 100 points, but you're at least growing by a year, so you got 75 points. And, but I adjusted the number of points that were awarded for low growth. Only those students who were not passing, but were considered in the prior year as pass plus, did they receive any points? Because I could be very confident that they were still at least passing the test. It's a very, I think when we were initially digging into this, we only found a handful of students across the state that went from pass plus down to did not pass. Typically, they only moved a category or two. So those are the only students I allowed to continue to receive points. All other students, if they were in low growth, they got 0 points. Then I also adjusted the points in the high growth, essentially still giving more points for those students who aren't passing but meeting high growth, because those students who aren't passing, again, if our model is set up as it's supposed to be, they're hitting high growth within 3 years, they will be passing the test. So I still wanted to incentivize that. So I gave that 150, and then I adjusted those students who were passing or pass plus and then hitting high growth, I adjusted that up to 125.
Is this on a spreadsheet? Like, how quickly can you manipulate? So and the reason why I'm asking is because if in the low movement categories for P3, P2 to P1, you're still passing. So those have 0 points.
You might be passing, you might not be. I was less confident, so I gave them 0.
So on the P3, P2, and P1, those aren't passers?
They are passing prior year. They're not necessarily passing current year. Right.
Okay.
The first chart is...
But we don't know?
We don't know. We don't know that much information.
So we
know
may
that they
give
are low
0
growth.
credit to a child who hits proficient, who passes.
Correct.
Or vice versa.
Right, or vice versa.
We don't want to
Okay,
give credit to a
right.
student that went down.
All I know is that they have low growth, which means they are no longer growing by 1 year. That's the only thing I'm confident saying. And so, again, this is my first scenario. Once I saw what the distribution looked like, and Maggie, I'm not putting blame there because I only sent these on Monday. She's been in presentation. She's been going. I get it. And I know I've sent her additional where I adjusted those points in that low growth. because I wasn't
And
necessarily.
I'm not trying to put anybody on the spot, but you didn't give us the data we need.
No, and I'm not trying to place blame or anything like that. They've been fabulous. It's more, I went back to the initial philosophy of where the chart came from, and I adjusted only in the low growth and the high growth, just to see what would happen.
Would we have time for today's sake if people are comfortable with 17, 18, keeping with our current model, knowing that for August, because we have to put something in the plan, August, we would take a look at, it sounds like people feel a little bit more comfortable scenario A. I don't want to put, I'm seeing some head nods.
I'm not
Can you
comfortable with
run?
scenario A.
You're not comfortable with scenario A?
No,
I'm not either.
it was only my first attempt. My first starting to play.
So let's play some more then.
Yes.
And we can bring that back by August. Is the board comfortable with that? We would still have some time to even in that narrative say that we're looking at some things. Are we comfortable with that?
Can I just ask, you have 4 scenarios here. We've just started on A. The other one that looks somewhat distributed over the 5 categories is C.
Right.
Can you just describe C before we table this?
The only difference I did between A and C is that I adjusted the low growth, the students who were start over. I adjusted the points awarded for those students who aren't passing, but only at typical movement. And I adjusted that down from 75 to a 50. 75 sort of translates into a C, right? But 50 translates into an F. And those students, if they are on typical growth, but they're not passing, they never get to passing. So you applied that idea. So they're never going to get to passing. So maybe that shouldn't get a C.
So you've done these charts based on some kind of logic. You just didn't play with the numbers and try to get a distribution.
No.
And so there's a rationale behind all this.
Absolutely.
I would like to see for August, because these charts are really good, I think, and it's moving in the direction that we should be headed, but what it really needs is sort of what was the criteria you changed.
Right.
And I know there hasn't been a lot of time. I'm sensitive to that, and I'm fine with that. But for August, whatever scenarios you present with the chart is great, with the numerical data, but just add those criteria that you toyed with.
I'm happy to do that. One thing that we need to also look at the same time is what impact, now these might give us a beautiful differentiation, but what impact does it do to the final grade?
That's what we were just talking about.
Because the final grade, as we know, is skewed the other direction.
Right.
So we need to be aware of what impact we have on the schools. So it'd be nice to include one more chart and graph of this is what this does overall.
Yeah, I guess my hope is at the August meeting, we have scenario A, B, C, D. Everything's laid out, so we're not debating some issues that aren't there. So we can choose among 4 rather than trying to create a new one on our own. I don't think it's useful for 11 people to do that. So that would be really helpful, just to have option A, B, C, and D, if that can happen.
Well, it won't necessarily be those A, B, C, and Ds.
That's fine. That's fine. We just need something specific from staff and just go with those.
And the impact that would have on summatives.
Yeah,
Because I think the
right.
board would have to know, if
Absolutely.
you're going to make these changes, what's going to happen in the end result?
Yeah.
So if we can get that.
Yeah. Maggie, we can go play, yeah.
And then I think, but then where does the discussion, because I like what Tony's been talking about too with this, is, so when I look at scenario C, for an example here, we're going to have a lot of schools that shift out of the A into a C, right? So what I need to get my mind wrapped around is that, because you're going to do that in 1 year's period, you're going to make a change, and that's going to happen. Right? I mean, that's essentially right. So has that A school really become a C? Is that now, are we saying that what used to be an A is now a C? Right? I mean, I think that's an important
Do the measures reflect?
Yeah, we have to have that piece of, Huh?
That's been a question forever with the summatives. Is that A really an A?
And you've shifted a lot of schools into the F category with this as well. So are those schools really F schools? To your point, that's what we have to, because again, what it feels like to me is we're making a shift to make a graph look like it's supposed to look. And I have a problem with that without knowing what really makes it be an A, what really makes it be an F. I hope I'm making some sense with that, because I feel like we're just playing with data here to make it look, which goes back to David's point, which is why I think this is so complex, right? It goes back to the definition of what is differentiated, or what is that? Yeah, sorry, I know I've made that, but it just does not feel good to me, folks, and I'm remiss if I don't say that.
I'll just offer, one little twist on that, and that is, if the board, looking at the data, says that these levels of inflation, then that may be a bit, whenever there's inflation involved in anything, to Dr. McCormick's point, was an ANA. Is this actually more reflective? I would agree that any system that feels like it's being gamed to make a chart, that doesn't feel good, and it never would. It would never be arguing for that. But I think the problem you're trying to overcome here is not so much that. It's actually especially when you juxtapose that to performance. It's hard not to argue that the growth sort of points are out of whack with the performance. So anyway, just offering that for your consideration.
And is it correct that the high school model there's no growth within the high school model, correct, the way that currently is?
So in 15-16, there wasn't, because we didn't have 2 years of data. We will see growth in the high school, though, beginning, from 8th grade to 10th grade. So there will be, for example, for 16-17 grades, we will see growth at the high school level.
Not under the new system, though. Under iLearn, there's no, we can push that. If we could, people can argue that you can make that work, but under iLearn with the new model.
It will be possible, but it will be a longer conversation.
Okay.
We've already confirmed that it's possible with Dr. Buddeman.
One of the other things too that I've meant to say but haven't said yet is that along the area of inflation of growth is that under the current model, schools can get more than all of their points. Right, so there's not a cap on growth. So, which also then masks other areas that may be deficient. So that's another piece that.
So we will commit then from our staff and the state board staff that we will bring back that information that Dr. Freitas brought up, align that to the summative so we can, but at least you have the background on all the complexities around it. So are you guys wanting to break now for lunch?
So wait a minute. So would you repeat what Dr. Freitas asked for?
So he is wanting some different scenarios. So we're going to run some more scenarios, not worried about necessarily that even distribution is what I'm hearing, but bring some more scenarios and also then run those scenarios into a summative grade so we can see what the impact will be, because this is just one indicator built into the grade. So once this is filtered, if we change the scenario, the growth part, it will impact the summative grade. So we need to know what kind of that's going to look like.
When does the new iLearn test come on board?
18-19.
18-19. So why are we even messing with this? Because ESSA says we have to report something. We'll report what we have and what we've been doing. Maybe we're just darn good. Maybe we are. So, I concur with Dr. Ernest. Why are we creating some sort of a scale that meets our needs rather than what measures what kids are doing based upon the tests that we have and based upon what the tests that we will be having in 18-19? it just doesn't make sense to me to try and manipulate the numbers to satisfy some sort of a scale or curve that makes us comfortable, rather than reflect what kids are doing.
So we don't have a consensus here. What I hear us saying is we need to come back in the August meeting with more information to come up with an approach that we want to take with this specific table.
And again, I don't think Steve's option's off the table
Sure,
because
absolutely.
Katie's mentioned it,
Right.
or Byron's mentioned it, as far
Right.
as there's so many moving targets like we talked about with the CCR, exact same thing. Not that anybody is wanting to say we don't want to push rigor, we don't want a more realistic look, but there's just so many factors to consider in this. So I think, Dr. Yeager, we will bring yours back to the table as well with more information.
If we're going to take a break, I want to quickly summarize the other things we need input on. We need to talk about the weighting of the indicators we've been discussing. I think that's something that will maybe help shed some light on the magnitude to which each of these individual pieces will factor into the whole system. And we also need to talk about school improvement, because if we're talking about accountability, the important thing that accountability does is identify the schools that need support and what we want to do to support those schools. So we're going to talk about definitions of how we are going to define the two new categories, targeted and comprehensive. And then we're also going to talk about ideas of how we want to approach supporting those schools and those subgroups that are in need. So that, and then we will be done with ESSA until August.
So
Not
let's do
until
the
August.
weights
but
and
that's
let's
okay.
take a working lunch. Are you
Okay.
guys comfortable with that? Let's get through the weights, do a working lunch, and keep moving.
One more comment, and as we went through the discussion and the creation of this growth proficiency table,
Okay.
and went through all different kinds of manipulation of numbers to create a bell curve, to create a curve that seemed to be satisfactory to anybody and everybody. And of course, you can't please everyone. But one of the things Dr. Pettibender also said was be very cautious about trying to to manipulate the numbers to match a curve that's in our heads, rather than pay attention to what the kids achieve. Thanks for allowing me to say that.
Absolutely, and I think that's kind of, Tony, I think said something similar, just be careful. I think we've heard that, so I think we will take that to note.
Yep.
Okay, let's look at weights.
So we have a couple of items with weights that I'm going to have to turn over to Maggie to sort of walk us through, because Maggie's the expert on this, and she can help us understand sort of our recommendations and where we think many of these things can shake out.
Okay, so there are a few requirements for the weights under ESSA, specifically as it pertains to the academic indicators versus the school quality student success indicator, which in our instance would be the college and career readiness achievement rate at high school and the chronic absenteeism component at the elementary and middle school side. So currently, we only have two indicators in our grades 3 through 8, and those are academic achievement and academic progress or growth. Currently, they are weighted equally at 50% of the grade each. We have to now consider the inclusion of two new indicators at the 3 through 8 side, which include the school quality student success indicator and the English language proficiency indicator. So a question of how to adjust these weights to accommodate for the inclusion of two new indicators was had with our work group. And we'll show you the information on the next slide as far as the thoughts behind that. A quick summary of the 9 through 12 side. Currently, there are 4 indicators that we see there: achievement, progress or growth, graduation rate, and then the SQSS indicator, which is our CCR achievement rate indicator. Currently, for schools, academic achievement and academic progress are weighted equally at 20% each, and then graduation rate and school quality student success are weighted equally at 30% each. So more weight on the high school side is given to graduation rate and CCR achievement rate. Mostly the philosophy behind that was that those are the focuses, the ultimate capstone of receiving a graduation diploma, as well as being college and career ready, were the emphasis there. So again, on the high school side, we also had to consider the inclusion of the English language proficiency indicator. So in working with the accountability group, there were a few things that were discussed. One of the requirements of ESSA is that the English language proficiency indicator does fall under the academic indicators and therefore must be given a, quote, significant weight in the overall accountability system. So a discussion was had about what a significant weight would be. We also had some concerns there because it will only apply to about 50% of the schools in the state, and other schools won't have that indicator. So how do we ensure that our system provides a fair and equitable aggregate information if not all the schools in the state will have that component incorporated into their letter grade? So with those two things discussed, the idea was that the weight of the English language proficiency indicator for these both 3 through 8 and 9 through 12 side would be 10%. There was a belief that that was significant, but also considered the fairness of schools who have that indicator available versus those who don't have that indicator available, and trying to mitigate that impact. On the school quality and student success indicator for 3 through 8, there was a lot of concern since it's a brand new indicator and it's not necessarily where folks wanted to be yet with that indicator, to try and keep that as low as possible. ESSA has no parameters on what the weight of the school quality student success indicator is. So the proposal was to make that as low as we felt comfortable with, which meaning 5% was where the work group landed on that indicator. So that's 15% that we had to pull out from academic achievement and academic progress. And the work group's proposal was to value progress more than achievement. So the 45% progress and 40% achievement was where the work group landed on their thoughts. So that is what is reflected up there for grades 3 through 8. I can pause there.
One thing I do want to jump into, because this took me a few times to look at it to understand it. The bottom row of each of the charts is if you have an N size large enough for every single indicator. The rows above are whether or not you're able to, whether or not you have an N size, how that other percentage will be distributed into the other indicators. So I just wanted to clarify that too for the dummies out there like me.
For reasons already discussed about our growth formula, I'm principally against valuing achievement lower than progress.
I agree with that.
I agree with that also.
Well, and the other thing to consider on that 9 through 12, with academic progress, that is a big question mark. If we will have anything to measure, you don't have to have growth at the high school level, and with iLearn 3 coming in, we haven't hammered that out. So we've put that in, not really knowing for sure how that's going to work. And so just something for the board to keep in mind, then that would change those percentages significantly.
Right, so on the high school side, real quick, it incorporates all of the indicators that we would currently have available to us. So the idea there, again, if we look at that final row of all indicators applicable, the work group wanted to maintain the emphasis on graduation rate and CCR achievement rate. So those are still weighed at 30% each at the end there of the day. And the 10% for English language proficiency was pulled equally from the academic achievement and academic progress components.
And this conversation happened prior to the graduation rate changes.
Yes.
Maggie, could we just take one at a time rather than trying to take all these variables? So can we just look at 3 through 8 for a second and try to make some policy decisions on that? One reaction from 3 board members on this side was that they thought that academic achievement should be weighted more than growth. And so that's a policy decision. The recommendation is opposite. So could we just start there and then see what the board reaction is to that? Should growth be higher than achievement, or achievement be higher than growth, or should they be the same?
Sure, and one point I'll make before discussion on that is that currently in our system, they are weighted equally.
Right.
So,
Does anyone have strong feelings on that?
Having been involved in, Dr. Freitas, in ground level meetings with all of this, we wrestled with that to the point where 5% difference in the two, and we finally landed on, because we couldn't get agreement, let's just make it equal. And I don't know that there's any scientific rationale for that, but that's the way it ended up.
There was tons of public comment supporting making it equal.
Yeah.
They wanted to value growth as much as proficiency.
And just being honest, the field understands the academic achievement is not great, and the academic growth looks pretty good, which we're having that whole discussion. So if you're an educator sitting in that and you know how it works, you're going to push for your weight being on growth. That would be the smart thing to do. So just call it what it is. I mean, there are pieces of this, but this whole conversation happened prior to the grad rate. I know we're on 3.8, so I won't get into that, but prior to people knowing we were looking at the academic progress indicator. I mean, you know, so that will play into this. But if I'm an educator sitting there and I know how to play the game, I'm going, oh, we got to have more weight on academic progress. So, and philosophically, some people do understand obviously the power of you want to grow a child whether they're achieving or not. So there are a couple things playing into this.
So can I make a recommendation? Again, I'm trying to keep us moving on 3 through 8, the last line, rather than 40, 45, 5, and 10. I'm going to throw out a proposal just to get us moving, that it be 45, 40, 5, and 10. And just to get that out there is...
So to summarize, that would mean that academic achievement is at 45, growth at 40, SQSS or attendance is at 5, and ELP is at 10.
Right, just, again, I think we need to talk specific proposals rather than, you know, talking around the issue.
Then you're flip-flopping the top two as well then.
Right, I'm flip-flopping the top two. I'm just taking 5 points from academic progress, which is the growth criterion, and move it over to the academic achievement. And at least a couple of members down this side wanted proficiency to be both. So I think that's an easy change.
I believe the people on the committee felt pretty strongly that no matter what, growth is where we need to spend our time trying to get students to proficiency, and they saw value in growth more than the proficiency when they had to do this balancing. So just trying to share and represent the committee's thoughts.
I mean, the ultimate goal here is for us to have a picture of what's happening in the schools, correct? So while I completely concur that growth is important, absolutely. We want every area to be pointing up. That's what we want to do. But what we need to understand is, are those kids where we want them to be? And if they're not, then how can we help you get them there? So if we take this growth-heavy model, while I do care that they're growing, I want to know where they're at. And if they're not at the bar yet, but they're growing, and it's so lopsided that we don't give them the attention or the help that they need. That's why I would err more than 5%, but I'll do with whatever the board wants to do.
Yeah, so the weightings and the distribution of those weights really is a reflection of what is valued.
Absolutely.
You know? So I think that is the discussion that you're having right now. What is valued and how much is it valued?
And again, I'm in no way, I mean, I've been in schools where you want to experience some success. And you go in there every day and you work really, really, really hard, and that grade comes back, and after I step after one, it's not a reflection of what you've done that year, but nonetheless, it's a reflection of where those kiddos are. So that's what we need to understand. It's not a reflection on the people in those classrooms. I think that's when things start to get skewed, but I would rather it be more than 5% apart, but.
Can I just think out loud with you, BJ, around this idea that the question you're framing is more, how might we use this as a tool to best deliver interventions to close achievement gaps?
Because
then that
polls, you can do that when it's growth heavy. That's my thought.
So that to me is helpful in terms of having some meaning to the numbers, and kind of why we would be making those suggestions that the numbers would change, to the point about wanting to understand the narrative around how Cynthia did different outcomes with the numbers. So that is helpful in terms of, if we're trying to use this as a way of framing that, schools, how might we give you the resources you need to sort of deliver, push in where needed for students to make sure that they're growing. But if their growth rate is not meeting the expectations we need to hit proficiency, what else do you need to get there? If that's the rationale, then that's something that I would feel comfortable supporting.
And again, growth, I completely want it. I'm glad that it's included here, but I think it should be, I think the growth to me is much less important than the proficiency. When we're trying to take a snapshot of what's going on in that school at that time, I think proficiency is much more important.
So BJ, you said that you would increase the proposal that I made from 5% difference, 45, 40, you would go 50.
And I'll defer. I mean, this isn't, I absolutely, well, what will the impact be? And again,
A little difficult to tell the impact because there is an indicator we really can't calculate at all, which is the ELP indicator. So it's very difficult to tell what the impact would be. But again, I think this kind of goes back to that question of should there be concern with what the distribution is, or should we be concerned with what we want to be looking at and valuing? Just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think how we play with the numbers is a bad way to go. I think we should decide, what do we value? Do we think proficiency is more important, therefore should be weighted more, or not? And again, it's philosophical, and those are the tough decisions that we make, but I would agree with the concept that proficiency is more important to be sure kids are meeting those competencies. You could have a student with a high growth level that never meets proficiency, frankly. And I think the goal we're trying to ensure is that they meet the proficiency levels.
But the design of the model is, yes, you've got a kid with if a kid with high growth hits high growth in 3 years, they will hit proficiency. It's designed so that they hit proficiency.
Right, but if we put growth above proficiency, it could be masked for those students.
Maybe they should be equal versus one above the other, again, because we have designed it such that you hit high growth in 3 years, you are at proficiency. That is from the initial direction from the federal government. When they first started allowing states to consider growth, it had to look at getting to proficiency within 3 years. I don't know that that is still a requirement. I don't believe it's still a requirement, but we have continued with that philosophy.
It really, in a certain respect, it dilutes and takes away the differentiation of a real A school from a C+ school that is able to mask as an A school.
I'm not arguing that the points
I'm not arguing, I'm just making the comments.
awarded are where they need to be. I'm simply going back to the philosophy. If we're talking about what, should one get more weight than the other, maybe they should be equal versus one's better than the other.
So I think we need to consider a couple things. One, the committee recommendation. They put a lot of time into it. Our current status of where we are, and as a board, we're manipulating academic progress. So I think we have to consider all of that. And I know people don't want to hear about the moving targets, but that's a reality when you're doing something like this. So one consideration is you make them equal, you can change them. So making them equal is, and that kind of is not probably going to make the committee happy. If they're wanting to see such an emphasis on growth, especially for those districts who only have 2 indicators in this, that's significant. You're moving a 10% swing, and so for some of those districts, that's going to be a big difference. Plus, we're throwing in ELL, plus we're throwing in, attendance won't be that big of an issue, but there are a lot of pieces coming into this that haven't been in before. So one consideration is you leave it as is, with a 50-50, we can change that. We have a new assessment coming in. We can change some of those things, just because I think another thing gets into the philosophical difference in academic achievement and growth and which is more important.
But can I ask a scenario? Is it possible for there to be a school with 100% of their students passing ISTEP get a lower grade with this than a school who does not, who has 70% of their kids passing ISTEP, but they have growth?
Again, it's hard to tell with those other two indicators. I don't think I can really give you an
Again,
answer to that.
Well, in this state, not too long ago, we used to have 100% proficiency, right?
Added?
Yeah, the weight was 100% proficiency and none on growth during my time on the board. I remember those days, and I think we've made success by putting growth in there. And at the time, I remember there was a lot of debate on the board and a lot of discussion about 60-40, 50-50, and those kinds of things. If we do go with the proposal that's on the table, we could always adjust it, right, after we see the results.
Yeah, I think a big theme of this is that there are a lot of things we're going to have to revisit between the CCR achievement rate, the growth table, the ELP indicator, and with the WIDA component in there. So there are quite a few, and iLearn, there are quite a few moving parts that Indiana is having to deal with in this. So.
And that was my question on impact. It wasn't impact on the schools. It was how does this impact everything else that you're doing? Because, and I still stand by the fact that I can't support something that has progress weighted heavier than.
So this in pretty much sounds achievement heavy, and I'm not meaning that critical. What are some thoughts down here? I mean, Marianne, I know you're talking from the committee, so you like growth. You like having that weight on growth. Steve, where you at? Marianne, did you have something to add?
I just wanted to add the reason for the EL weight and to probably not, there was a lot of discussion on that, and to play with that is really an issue. They talked extensively about the weight of one group could impact your letter grade. And so to go more than 10% could move you more than a letter grade if you're not successful there. So I just hesitate to do anything with the EL piece. That was.
The proposal is not to do.
I think we're good with the EL and the school quality. I think we're good with that 5 and 10.
Just making sure.
It's the other two, yeah. Right?
Yes,
Yeah,
that's
okay.
correct. We're not recommending
Yeah.
changing that.
And the recommendation was to flip flop.
Right. Don't want the 10% difference in the first two, or in the first one? 555. Steve?
Yes, we're just flipping the
flipping them
numbers.
off.
Those two
between-
columns.
Okay. Where you at, Steve? I mean, I know you're down at the end of the table, but.
Yeah. Accurate to say I feel strongly both ways.
That's fine.
You know, it's.
I get it.
That's fine.
I can go with either one.
Katie, where are you?
I just want to repeat it back and make sure I understand it, because to be truthful, I'm having a hard time seeing the screen from over here. So we would be talking about doing 55 for academic achievement and 45 for academic progress.
Yeah, we're
Is that
flipping the
correct?
first two
Okay, I just want to make sure, as a lawyer, that I understand the proposal in front of me.
And then on the last one, just so you know, it's 45-40 because we've put in those other cells a weighting for ELP and school quality.
Okay.
So there's a 5% difference on those.
You know, having heard all of the robust conversation around those pieces, I do think it's important that we are focusing on achievement because of the way that it impacts all of the other goals that we have. So I would be comfortable supporting that recommendation. I think it's also not so imbalanced that growth doesn't get lost.
Is there any concern with straying from the current practice of the 50-50? Not to belabor the conversation,
Yeah, we
but
just said no.
Okay.
To that.
just making sure, dotting my I's, crossing my T's here.
I mean,
All right.
if we're representing to the public, say you have a family looking to, try to decide between a couple communities they may want to move into, and they're looking at the schools. If we're representing to the public that a school is an A, that school should already have high performance. It shouldn't be on the road to a high performance at an A. Right now, we have a system where you can be on the road to high performance and get an A.
Okay, so we will make some adjustments in ESSA and we'll go from there.
Hey.
Okay,
High school?
high school.
Should we apply the same concept there?
Well, the
Or is
issue,
it different?
well, my biggest concern, I mean, we can get this in place, but just so the board understands, and correct me if I'm wrong, that academic progress is a big what if. Because there's no way to measure it right now unless someone, I know Cynthia's working with experts in that area to say, how do you, that is going to be a hard sell to the field to stretch that. So it may be, like Dr. Freitas said, it may be a huge weight on academic achievement. I don't think we're going to put that on, given the situation with some of those other indicators. It may be a big weight on academic achievement. Just so you know, that second column is very questionable. Do you not agree with that, Cynthia? I know you think there's a way to do it. We have short time to come up with a plan.
Scholarship will be possible. In mathematics, it's the question. In mathematics, it definitely is still possible. It's more problematic given where we, depending on where we land with the end of course assessments for Algebra 1. It is definitely possible to calculate growth from iLearn to ECAs, from grade 8 to grade 9, from grade 8 to grade 10. It is possible to calculate, it's more difficult to get growth from grade 6 iLearn to grade 7 ECA or grade 7 iLearn to grade 8 ECA. We should still be able to get from grade 7 to grade 8 given the number of students.
You're going to have a chunk of kids that take the algebra and then take potentially SAT, ACT, which that would be.
That is not possible.
So, but that's.
That
Then it becomes, is that academic progress even on the table? So I hate to muddy the waters because they've been so clear for 2 days. But you take that same chart and it's almost like we need to have the discussion of if there's academic progress and if there's not. Because I'm not sure we're going to know that.
Yeah,
For 18-19.
this will reflect.
Okay. So this will be for 1 year basically is what we're working on. Okay. Got it.
Well, then let's start phasing it out,
Phasing out,
like 70-30.
are you saying I'm trying to understand, are you saying you want to,
He's saying phase out growth,
got it, okay.
I think. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Okay. Was this the recommendation of the committee?
This was the recommendation of the committee.
But when you say 70-30, you're saying that would be for 1 year, and then when iLearn comes in, then we would look at it again? Is
Yeah,
that
because
what you're
probably whatever
suggesting?
comes next is going to be less generous than this.
Whatever comes next, what?
Under iLearn is probably going to end up not giving the same type of weight to what they're getting under this proposal. Don't have a dramatic shift later, maybe start accelerating it now. But in all fairness, I was a 70-30 person at the inception of the original account.
So my question is, with the graduation rate, knowing that it takes into it, right, well, have we gotten an answer on that, Leanne? Is a 17-18 impact? Because if we're leaving the graduation rate at 30%, given the changes, and for some of the districts, 50%, I mean, high schools? They haven't called you back?
Did I hear we're talking about 1 year?
No, this is just for 17-18.
Then why are we messing with it? Stick with what the recommendation is.
Well, we got to consider the graduation rate hit, though, I think.
Yeah, so the recommendations consider the changes with the addition of the English language proficiency indicator.
Yeah, those have to go
So,
in.
yeah, so the thing we're doing here is acknowledging the inclusion of that and trying to say whether or not we agree with the way that the weights get redistributed to remove that 10% for the English language proficiency. But if your point is why move from what's being recommended, I guess that's a question for the board.
I make a procedural suggestion that we just deal with the top line first. There's a recommendation on the part of my colleague for 70-30 achievement versus progress. Could we just talk about that first, agree on that, and then go to the other ones?
So I want to provide a little bit of clarification on
Okay.
that. So that would only apply to a high school that does not have a grade 12. So you would be essentially saying we're going to measure high schools without a grade 12 in one manner and high schools that do have a grade 12 in another manner. So I think it's probably easiest to look at it, this is my suggestion, I think it's actually easiest to look at it as the very last column because it's equal distribution as you go down.
Okay, good point. So let's look at the last line rather than jumping back and forth and back and forth. What do people feel about the last line, achievement and progress? Tony, you made the initial recommendation. What would you make the recommendation for that last line to look like?
I mean, my feeling personally is that achievement is too low at 15%, and that probably graduation is too high, given the, recent changes to that, and then school quality and student success is definitely too high. That's my personal.
So do you have a recommendation on?
No.
Okay, not yet.
So I think we leave English language proficiency alone, CCR alone. I think it might be my opinion, we look at decreasing that graduation rate percentage based on some of our districts are going to be at zero. So it's problematic given the changes of graduation rate and up the academic and up the, I don't know, I'm not doing percentages right now, I don't have those in my head, but up the, or if we're going to go a 5% higher on the academic achievement above, stay consistent with the 5% difference between academic achievement and academic progress, but take some of that weight off graduation rate would be, but I like having the weight on CCR just because I think that, I mean, there's, and I know that's fluid, but I would say you leave those last two columns alone.
So are we looking at, I'll let the board respond to that first before we start talking about specifics.
Let's go to that third column. Let's talk about grad rate for just a minute, just to get that, because that's that's 30%.
And
So are you
columns
concerned?
3 and 4, where I have questions, explain to me like what is represented by school quality and student success?
At the high school level, that would be your college and career readiness achievement rate. So that's,
I'm sorry?
So at the high school level, that's your college and career readiness achievement rate. So the number of graduates that are earning a dual credit industry cert or passing an AP or an IB exam.
And that's the one we thought we would leave alone for.
Let me make a recommendation, just get something on the table, get us moving. I would suggest 35, 15, 10, 30, and 10. Again, that's 35 for the first column, 15, 10, 30, and 10. Again, just putting it out there to get something we can discuss. The notion being, I agree with the graduation rate. I think that needs to be lower, so I agree with the superintendent on that. I sense that at least some of the members are saying achievement should be more than academic progress. So that's why I'm suggesting 35, 15 on that. We leave last column the same.
Last two columns the same? Or
Last two columns the same. So I'm redistributing essentially some of the graduation rate, 20% from that, and also leaving the growth the same. So essentially what I've done, I've taken
You lowered the growth.
percentage from rate and lowered the growth by 5 and put it into academic achievement.
Do we think that academic achievement should be higher than the CCR number for high schools? If we're looking at the end measure of success as being that readiness, I would be uncomfortable with the academic achievement, anything being higher than the 30% that we're assigning for that CCR, since collectively we've agreed that that is the ultimate measure of success.
They're saying the first column and last column should be the same?
I think there's logic in that, in terms of philosophically, sort of the truths that we've been working to plant in the ground around big picture, what's orienting our work and decisions more broadly. That would be an important consideration.
Do you want to increase those numbers, or could we just take the 15 from grad rate and do 30, 15, 15, 30, 10? Or do you want to increase?
I I understand Dr. McCormick's counsel around keeping that 30% because that's consistent with all of the other choices that we've made. I guess the counsel I'm providing is, as we look at increasing academic achievement in progress, right, because that was one of the suggestions, I think we should not make academic achievement higher than 30%, which was the first calculation, right? If I heard that correctly, it went up to 35%. And so where I would weigh in, as we're trying to get these numbers right, is that nothing would be higher than the 30% that we're comfortable with for CCR. Because that's where we are, that's one of the measures that we are holding to as being a key outcome of whether we've been successful as a K-12 system when they're exiting.
Do we want to stay consistent with how far, with, we did 5% difference in 3.8? Stay similar to that with 9-12, I would think.
I think that makes sense. So what would happen, I guess, BJ, in terms of what you're doing, what would happen, or what would shift if we made academic achievement 30? How would we adjust those other numbers so that academic achievement and CCR were equally weighted? What other adjustments would you then be comfortable with?
I mean, one possibility would be 30, 20, 10, 30, 10. 30, first column, 20, second column, 10, third column, 30, the next column, and 10. What that would do is...
30, 20, 10, 30, 10, is that what you said?
Right.
I'm sorry, okay.
So it would equalize your point, Katie, which I totally agree with. I think that's a really good point. We still have a slight difference between growth and proficiency, putting a priority on proficiency so it meets that particular need.
If I may make a suggestion, we've asked Cynthia and Maggie to create some data charts on growth. I believe that if we create some charts to show how that affects schools and give some of those percentages, that might help you be able to make better decisions.
And you run that with the new grad rates?
Well, we could run that, yes, but we would not be able to add the English language proficiency.
Right, but run what we can run and have some indication.
Right now, what we have available to us is the 2016 data. So we can show what the 2016 letter grades would have been with the weights adjusted. That wouldn't consider, what we can do on top of that is with the graduation rate, apply the federal rate rather than the state rate for both the graduation indicator, and that would also impact the CCR achievement rate. Yeah, we can't do EL, so what we would do is do whatever the weights are that are being recommended if we were to adjust and not have the EL included in there to see what that looks like.
Is the board comfortable with that, to have that information in August, like we're going to have for the other?
Yes.
I think we reached some consensus on some core values, right? So a core value would be the notion that achievement is weighted higher than growth. So I hope we don't lose those in this translation. That I'm all for seeing the charts. I think we should see the charts. But do we then change our core values because of a chart? So I'm just commenting. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm saying we should do it. But I hope we don't change core values based on data that we see on how it's going to impact schools.
Dr. Freitas, can you reiterate the weighting that you would like to see as an example for us to run numbers on?
Sure. 30, 20, 10, 30, 10.
Thank you.
What does ESSA require us to submit?
The only requirements around the weightings involve the comparison of the academic indicators versus the non-academic indicator. So what that means is your indicators of graduation rate, achievement, progress, and English language proficiency have to hold significant weight in the overall accountability system.
Say that again.
Your indicators of academic achievement, progress, graduation rate, and English language proficiency have to hold significant weight in the overall accountability system.
What's sufficient?
Well, they don't define significant. Always a fun one to leave open. We've kind of defined that as 10% because we can see that that can impact a letter grade if we have that weighted at 10%. The other kind of parameter on this is that you're in the aggregate, those 4 indicators have to weigh more than your non-academic indicator, which would be your CCR achievement rate or the attendance indicator.
And we had some sort of a committee look through this.
Yes, our work group did look at the weighting distributions.
And their recommendation was?
Everything that's up on that.
I can't see that.
Okay, so it is at the high school side, achievement at 15, progress at 15, graduation rate 30, school CCR achievement at 30, and English language progress at 10.
Well, that was one of 4 options that they looked at.
So we looked at a few different ideas and concepts as far as what to do. Ultimately, that committee looked at saying that they wanted to, at the high school side, weight achievement and progress equally, but acknowledge that graduation rate and CCR achievement rate was valued more than achievement and progress at the high school level because those are capstones of the ultimate high school program.
And they also did not have the data about the grad rate that we received when they were making these recommendations.
Have our marching orders for August. We all comfortable with that? Okay. Let's take a break for lunch before we go into school improvement.
All right.
You guys want to have a working lunch? Are you all good with that? If we get it? Okay, let's do 10 minutes, grab, and come back up.
How much longer?
How much longer do you think, Patrick, for school improvement? Can we get through in about an hour?
Probably a half hour to 45
Half hour?
minutes.
Okay. Yeah, we'll bring our lunch back up? Because lunch is here. So.
Most rigorous interventions. And so when we wrote our plan in that section, we were very clear to cite state law and say this is how our state defines most rigorous interventions. Other than that, the other focuses of school improvement in the sort of less severe category are the purview of the state board. So we're going to do 2 sections on school improvement, and then we will mercifully be done for the day. We're going to be doing a section on how we identify schools for school improvement, and then we're going to talk briefly about some of the interventions we're looking at employing. I will say that the intervention section was part of the engagement that happened was when Jim interviewed many of you to talk about school improvement. Your feedback and other interviews of stakeholders from superintendents to community leaders to association representatives, many of the folks who touch school improvement specifically were involved in the kind of creation of this. I'd also, at a time when we're less busy and not as focused on ESSA, would like to come back and have Jim come and provide some more detailed debrief of the elements that he heard when he was out in the field talking to folks. So I'm going to turn this first section over to Maggie to talk briefly about how we identify schools that are slated for improvement.
So there are some requirements in ESSA about the school improvement, about how schools get identified for school improvement supports. Specifically, there are 2 different categories. One is comprehensive support and one is targeted support. Comprehensive support has some explicit requirements as to, yes?
Is that information in here anywhere?
It should be in, if you have the PowerPoint slides.
Page 37. Thank you.
I think I have different page numbers. So the requirement of the state is to establish a methodology to identify categories for comprehensive support and improvement. that is based on the system of annual meaningful differentiation in the state, or its accountability system. Explicitly under comprehensive support, they kind of give us what needs to happen on this one. Schools that are the lowest performing schools must be identified at least once every 3 years, beginning with the 18-19 school year, based on 17-18 data. High schools with low graduation rates must be identified at least once every 3 years, beginning in 18-19 school year. And schools with chronically underperforming subgroups have to be identified at least once every 3 years. And that initial identification is a state determined because of the need to have it establish a chronic issue. So going into a little bit of detail there, for the lowest performing, ESSA explicitly requires that at least the lowest performing 5% of Title I schools be identified for comprehensive support under that criteria. For the graduation rate criteria, any public high school, regardless of Title I status, that is failing to graduate at least a third of its students in the 4 years is supposed to be identified for comprehensive support under this criteria. And the last criteria with the subgroups is any public school that had previously been identified for additional targeted support that did not improve over the state's timeline. So those are the requirements for the comprehensive support and improvement identification. For reference, in the appendix, page 31 gives you some concept and ideas of what we're looking at as far as the number of schools that would be identified. So if we're looking at total number of Title I schools in the bottom 5%, we would have 51 schools that would fall under that criteria. Total schools identified with the high school graduation rate would be 26. Yes. Yep. And the caveat there is that this was run with the state graduation rate, not the federal rate. So we would likely see an increase in schools there. However, we had 9 of those schools were not previously identified under the bottom 5% criteria. So if they're picked up under that bucket, they don't get double dinged, they're just incorporated already. We aren't able to run the subgroup information because we don't have the chronic underperforming information, but that gives you a little bit of an idea of what we're looking at there.
The minimum timeline set by the federal government is once every 3 years. Is there any sense that in Indiana we should have a higher standard? And if so, why? And if not, why not? So actually, Indiana has been identifying schools every year, annually for this, and that is in the recommendation or in the draft is the proposal is to continue to utilize that approach of identifying schools annually. So that's a real plus for us, and we should highlight that. Mm-hmm. Great. So for comparison, our current system that we had under the ESEA waiver identified 2 types of schools, priority schools and focus schools. Your priority schools were any Title I schools that received an F, any Title I high school that had a 4-year graduation rate of 65% or less, and schools were identified annually based on the previous year's data. We also had focus schools, which were any Title I school that received a D and that were not already identified as priority schools, and then any Title I high school that had a graduation rate under 60% for 2 consecutive years. Also there, I have a note that for state purposes, eligibility criteria was expanded to encompass all public schools. So the priority and focus really only looked at your Title I schools. At the state level, we do have to consider any school, public school that receives an F. So just wanted to make that note. So what we put in the draft plan as far as the identification of schools for this is to consider our system currently of the A through F system and try to reconcile that with this bottom 5% approach. So currently, all of the schools that are identified in the bottom 5% also receive an A. But it is possible moving forward as performance increases that some of those schools in the bottom 5% could be a D.
So what we wanted to have here is kind of a way to address that and say that all schools that either receive an F or that are in the bottom 5% would be identified for comprehensive support, and that's Title I schools. So if they received an F, they would be included, or if they were in the bottom 5%, they would be included.
Maggie, question. When we report to the feds, do we report what they want, or do we report what we do? Hopefully that makes sense. Like, because on that, you only have to have for the feds Title I schools. Well, the way our state statute reads, we do all. How do we report when we report?
So to the feds, with comprehensive schools, it would only be your Title I schools that
Okay,
get.
so we report according to theirs, right? Okay, I was just, for some reason that popped into my head because it's like, that would make us look different accordingly.
Right. So to get an idea, again, of this comparison between the bottom 5% versus schools that receive an F, if we look at, again, bottom 5% of Title I schools was about 51 schools in 2016. If we look at the total number of Title I schools with an F letter grade, it would be 85 schools. So we have a difference there of about 34 schools. And in talking with board staff on this, there was really a discussion that we wanted to ensure that we were capturing as many of those schools that needed the services as possible. So we wanted to include that term of bottom 5% or letter grade of F, whichever results in more schools for Title I. For the low graduation rate for high schools, our proposal or the draft recommendation included any public high school that was failing to graduate at least a third of their school students. We didn't stray from the terms of the requirements, base requirements of ESSA on that. And similarly, the same thing for the chronically underperforming subgroup. We stuck to what ESSA requires on that as the base minimum. So any school where there is one or more subgroup that is chronically underperforming.
Question on that. So when you say subgroup, definition of subgroup is several ethnic groups. And any sense of where we currently are with that? Because that could garner all sorts of resources that we may not have. So do you have a projection on that?
We don't right now. I can give you a little bit of information in one moment on the targeted support that we can kind of give an idea of what our baseline would be. One point on the subgroups, so that would be all of your ethnic subgroups, your free reduced lunch, special education, and English learners. Right. So it encompasses more than just the ethnic groups. When we get into targeted, we'll kind of talk, you have to have a subgroup that is performing in the bottom 5% for a set number of years, so consecutive number of years in order to fall into this category. So we won't see kind of the ripple effect of this for a few more years based on how we identify schools for targeted support. So state also has to establish exit criteria for schools in comprehensive support, which includes a timeline to meet exit criteria, and that timeline for comprehensive cannot exceed 4 years. So all schools would have 4 years to exit their comprehensive support status. And it goes on to say that a failure to exit comprehensive support must result in more rigorous state-determined interventions. And that'll be something that is covered more in a later section when you guys finally get rid of me. So as said earlier, our current exit criteria for priority schools is to receive at least 2 consecutive years of a C or better on the accountability system, or receive 1 year of an A. We wanted to kind of take an approach of saying we wanted to see consistent achievement from the school rather than just saying if you hit an A, you automatically exit. So we limited this to just looking at schools no longer meeting the eligibility criteria for comprehensive support for 2 consecutive years to demonstrate that they they exceeded or have been able to maintain, which is also seen there in the second bullet point of requiring schools to demonstrate some sort of plan for sustainability of the progress that they made, so that we're not just leaving the school and abandoning it after it has managed to hit the achievement that would exit them from that criteria, so that there is some sort of plan to maintain whatever progress they've made.
Is there a follow-up after 2 years to be sure that their plan has been implemented and they have sustained their growth and sustained quality? Was that considered at all?
I don't have an answer to that necessarily, but I can, we can look at that as a part of our next draft.
If you can think about that, because school can have a plan and put resources into it and try to do it, but I think it'd be important to monitor whether or not they've actually made progress. If they have, great. If they haven't and have gone back to a non-quality kind of school, then we may need to add additional resources. So I don't want to abandon that school.
Our school improvement team will be monitoring plans, and I think your point about sustainability is really important, and that's one of the themes that came up over and over again when Jim went out to the field and interviewed all of you and superintendents and folks like that.
Okay, so there is a monitoring component that's currently in progress. Great.
So that is kind of the summary of the identification and exit criteria for your comprehensive support. I don't know if there are any concerns or comments or questions on that component. If not, I can move on to the targeted support.
Well, I have just a general question. What's the department's equivalent now to what they used to call the turnaround department? That Jim Larson did a fantastic job running, actually.
He did a fantastic job, and we've been fortunate that Jim, he's been instrumental in helping us develop our ESSA plan around school improvement. So not only does Jim have the experience of operating school improvement and turnaround in Indiana, but now he actually is working across the nation. So we tapped into that resource when we developed this section. And so what I would say, currently, we have an Office of School Improvement, and the Office of School Improvement, when you hear the supports, they're very similar. The board takes different action now. The law has been changed. There isn't the same type of takeover as there was 6 years ago, but there are different actions that the board takes, and the Office of School Improvement is very involved in monitoring and supporting those schools that have been identified.
I just wanted to be able to call it the right name. So Office of School Improvement.
Office of School Improvement, that's right. And just to further note that Jim Larson will be helping. We have a new director in school improvement, and so Jim's coming in to do a little bit of mentoring for a couple months to make sure that team is ready to go. So that should give you some confidence also.
Great.
So a few points on the comprehensive work. This was presented to the work group that we had. Some of the discussion revolved around the identification of all schools versus just Title I schools, and a discussion of resource allocation. So where we fell with that is what you see here in this recommendation is what is reflective of what the work group ultimately would have recommended as well. So targeted support is kind of a new thing with ESSA. We did not have an equivalent under the ESEA waiver to targeted support. So what this does is it focuses specifically on the performance of subgroups, of your ethnic subgroups, free reduced lunch, special education, and English learners. There are two different kind of, I guess, pathways under the targeted support and improvement category. The first is the consistently underperforming subgroup, which is any public school with one or more consistently underperforming subgroup as defined by the state, what it means to be consistently underperforming. And then there is the low performing subgroup. At our level, at the state level, the low performing subgroup is what would trigger the state monitoring and involvement. The consistently underperforming is managed and monitored entirely at the LEA level under ESSA. So we really focused on the low performing subgroup here, which is any public school in which one or more subgroups is performing at or below the performance of all students in the bottom 5% of Title I schools. So on page 31 in the appendix, you can see kind of a breakdown of what we see with those underperforming subgroups. So the total number of schools with subgroups in the bottom 5% of Title I schools was 93, and 63 of those schools were already identified for comprehensive support. So like you're seeing, about 30 additional schools brought in for targeted support here that were not previously identified for comprehensive. So in looking at this, as I stated earlier, there's currently no equivalent to targeted support in our federal plan. So we had two proposals really. Since the definition of consistently underperforming subgroup has to be defined by the state, our proposal was to align that as much as possible to the component that is monitored by the state and have the definition of a consistently underperforming subgroup be a subgroup that is performing in the bottom 5% of all students for 2 or more years. So that way we can ensure that we are capturing those students, subgroups that are just supposed to be monitored at the LEA level, that we are actually being able to capture them and bring them into the monitoring at the state level.
Is there a minimum number for each of the subgroups? Because there's multiple subgroups.
Yeah, so for the identification, we would use 10 as your minimum number to identify whether or not that the school would have that subgroup available to look at.
So if it's fewer than 10, would you provide resources or you would not provide resources at all?
No, this is where that N size comes into play again. So you would have to have at least 10 students in that subgroup to be able to calculate and identify if you were in that bottom 5%. So the timeline for exiting that targeted support group of a low-performing subgroup also has to be established by the state. And if a school fails to exit that targeted support, then that's where you elevate to the comprehensive support and improvement under the chronically low-performing subgroup. The state gets to determine the number of years for a school to maintain that targeted support before they would go into the comprehensive support status. So in looking at that, we tried to kind of mimic the exit criteria for the targeted support as is in place for the comprehensive support, just to keep it consistent. So again, the subgroup would have to perform at a C or better to exit the targeted support for at least 2 consecutive years. And also there would also be a requirement for a demonstration of strong plan for sustainability of the progress the school has made. And the timeline for exiting would be 5 years after initially identified for targeted support. So that again was discussed with the work group. We thought 5 years was something that was reasonable as far as the timeline, because sometimes when you're focusing on one subgroup, you may end up losing out on another subgroup. So we wanted to be able to accommodate for that in this timeline. So again, if they don't exit after that 5 years, then that's when they would be elevated to comprehensive support. So any questions on the targeted support or the comprehensive support identification and exit?
So before we dive into some of the interventions that we're recommending, I want to note that I am pinch hitting because we did just bring on our Director of School Improvement. So I'm going to present some of the work that we're looking at doing, but I want to name that we have a new Director of School Improvement, and that person's going to be able to shape a lot of this. And so I just want you to know that I'm just up here pinch hitting for now. So just to reiterate, we spent a lot of time going around the state and talking to a lot of folks before we came back with some recommendations. We wanted to engage the field, There were, I would characterize a lot of superintendents who were happy, excited to have conversations with the department about what they need and the kinds of supports they're looking for. And we got a lot of really interesting feedback. We talked to superintendents, and those superintendents would bring in principals and teachers who work in the lower performing schools so that they can be a part of the conversation as well. So a lot of administrative leadership, but also many of the folks who are in the classrooms every day kind of working with these students. We also had community partners come in. We had some folks who were with the civil rights community participate in the conversation as well. We talked to charter school authorizers to get their perspective on this process. We talked to elected state officials. We made sure that we reached out to the chair and ranking member of each of the committees in the House and the Senate and offered to have conversations with them. Many of them accepted, so we had good conversations from the legislative perspective. We involved the governor's office as a part of the conversation as well, and appointed state officials. We thank you all for spending some time with Jim and having that conversation. And then we also made sure that the partner organizations that have been engaged in the ESSA process in a variety of ways were also part of this conversation. So Principals Association, Superintendents Association, ISTA, all of those folks were at least part of this. So we try to cast the net wide in a very short amount of time, and we're very lucky that we were able to have the conversations that we did. Sorry. We had a vision and guiding principles that were set, and we had something for folks to react to. So we wanted to ensure that all students were college and career ready and could successfully embark on their chosen path in life. We thought that last part was really important, and we kind of walked through the kinds of principles we're looking at in our school improvement approach. It needs to be focused. We need to be able to share the resources and the best practices that we have. We're looking to partner as strong as we can with communities. We want to cultivate great leadership and great ideas and bring them into the process. And we also want to be able to scale the interventions. It doesn't work if you just have a few schools in isolation doing great work. We want to be able to scale it across the state, with the overarching principle of empowerment of districts and schools to make as many decisions and choices as they can. This is not readable on this slide, but one of the attachments you received was our theory of action. It's a series of if-then statements. So if the DOE does this, by, and it also includes a few bullets underneath that say by, that sort of articulate in more detail the kinds of actions that we'll take. With the last sentence being the goal of our school improvement, it's that all students can embark on their chosen path in life. That is in your packets, and we included that, and it's also posted on the State Board website for the folks watching at home. And it was based on the consensus from the stakeholders we had in the field. So the approach that schools wanted to see was a clear sequence of how we go about supporting those schools. So the most important first step is to do a comprehensive needs assessment to see what the schools actually need in terms of support. They'll go through a school improvement planning process, and I know I'm kind of running over these at a high level, but I just want to kind of make sure we talk about each step. Once they've developed that improvement plan, there are a variety of paths that we can take. That could include helping them partner with technical assistance providers, us engaging in some type of professional learning, or working with other external partners as necessary. One of the things I want to mention here that's a good practice that's been elevated to us that we find interesting is making sure that school districts who have similar needs or issues could potentially work together. So we're looking for some type of cross-school or cross-district collaboration so that they can share best practices and kind of work together. as an approach that schools, I think the field found compelling, and we also found compelling because we could then potentially pool resources and leverage technical assistance providers across the state or across a region of schools. The other element that other states have done that's interesting would be to bring some technical assistance providers together with some schools and have them talk to each other before they engage in some contract for services. This would be, it's been referred to as speed dating, where you get everybody into a room and they're able to have some conversations with each other, understand the needs of the school and what the technical assistance providers can require. So there are other states that have engaged in these kinds of processes. And these were some of the elements that were elevated as practices that that we could do that could deal with that scale issue, and also deal with the fact that it's useful to have many conversations about a problem to figure out what the actual solution should be. There are a couple of approaches we can take to awarding funds. I referenced one earlier. One approach would be awarding grants for school improvement for a single school. The other approach we could take is that multiple school approach that I had referenced before. In a region, there may be multiple schools that have the same issue, and it makes sense in terms of economies of scale to, if we've identified that in our needs assessment, that everyone is working together on that problem. So an approach we can take is to do a multiple school improvement grant approach, but also potentially a single improvement grant approach as well.
Would that be pursuant to like a transformation zone application?
That could potentially be one of the solutions, but it could be a variety of different approaches.
But would you anticipate that these multiple schools would apply together, or you would identify them and group them?
I'm not sure what the process would be yet, but it could be the case that we say to schools, we've done this analysis, we see that you all have these common issues. Would you want to pool resources and work together on an issue? We're still working out the details on this, and I know you probably have more questions and could go into a lot of detail.
I can't think of anywhere in my district that would work.
Sure, understand. And again, we're trying to maximize the flexibility that we can have under ESSA, because we don't have to do the order off the menu scenario anymore. We can come up with our own approach, and we want to do what's best for schools and what works for schools to support them. Yeah. Right.
So that would make sense.
Right. Right.
Yeah, they would have to want to do it together.
Right. Yeah. Right. The other thing I want to note here as a caveat is that the state board has the power over the most rigorous interventions still, and so I don't want to take that off the table as part of that conversation, but I want to acknowledge what, the work that we can do kind of on the early end of intervention, and then the work that you all do when the intervention becomes much more necessary or much more rigorous. So that's also very hard to read. I'm very sorry about that, but we wanted to kind of show some of the processes that the stakeholders went through and how they thought through this. There were kind of 6 things that stakeholders want. They really want regular and clear communication from the department and from the state board. So as much alignment as we can make from our system and the federal system and the work that the state board does and the work that the department does. Alignment is critical, and clear communication is also critical. They want us to help them build capacity identify their needs and help them build capacity to solve their problems at a local level. They want differentiated supports as much as possible. Schools have a variety of needs, and a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't fit for them. So differentiation is critical from the school perspective. They want and I won't read through kind of every single one of them, but you can go back and see the slides. But a lot of the items that they've recommended to us for school improvement are fairly consistent with practices that you all in your capacities have been engaged with for a while. So I know that I'm still, like I said, I'm pinch hitting for this and would love to have our school improvement team and Jim come back and talk in more detail about this, but I wanted to give you a brief overview of some of the elements we've included in our plan that will be going forward with ESSA. That's it.
Question. Yes. Plan is excellent and it's well thought out. It incorporates input we receive from throughout the state. It's based on best practices. In particular, doing a needs assessment up front is really a critical component. So I was really happy to see that. Many times we just throw money at schools without having a needs assessment and a plan, so that was terrific. The other thing you said is schools working across districts. Sometimes we have silos of districts.
That's right.
And the collaboration is powerful. And so there's many features in here. I think this section is exemplary. Question I have for you is the assessment component, which is how do we assess the outcomes of this? We're going to be expending taxpayer money, and I always like to have a measurement of whether we accomplished what we intended to accomplish. So there's going to be a plan and there's going to be implementation, but how do we know if the money was well spent and there's been success within that particular school or school corporation?
Or Leanne to have some conversation too. I will mention, we will seek out some national partners that have had results. They do have the evaluation piece to it. So we don't have all that figured out yet, but we know that has to be a part of it. So we're starting to have conversations with folks who are experts in this area to give us feedback in that very area. So it is on our radar. We'll have a better answer for you down the road, but we're just now in that exploratory of how do we make sure we're using our resources wisely? Is it working? A lot of those same questions to be held accountable for it.
Yeah, I would suggest in our ESSA report that you close the loop on that.
Okay.
I think it's really important, and it sounds like you're making progress on that, and to leave that out, I think, would be somewhat of a hole. So I would just acknowledge that you understand the importance of the evaluation component and then give some examples of how you're doing that. But congratulations.
Thank you.
This is a wonderful section.
Thank you. Thank you.
Patrick?
Yes.
You mentioned it, and it was one of the big things that I brought up in talking to Jim of having lived this on lots of different levels and through different administrations now. The one piece that I really like is the vetting. I forget how you worded it, and I was just making sure it was in the plan because I think it's so important, the vetting of the different services that are out there. Because, and the way I described this to Jim was, there were times when I felt like in the takeover situation, we almost had too much money. Now let me qualify that, because then you had, I say that cringing, but yet I think it's something that people need to think about, right? Because then you had every organization, anybody that had ever done anything was wanting a piece, right? And I'm just calling it like it is. And I felt like that at times. And then I felt like I needed to support all those different things. And so I think we need to continue to be very cognizant of that and let's put our money where it's going to do the most good. I just think that's being good public servants, of getting that where it is. And for those that are going to live this, I would hate for them to have to go through some of that I did on that. So that's more of a personal thing, but I think it's really, really important. And I know Jim, when I talked to him, he said we hear that in other states and people feel that. So I know I wasn't alone in that, but I want to make sure that is somewhere in there of how that plan looks for that.
Thank you. Any other thoughts or feedback on this section of school improvement? Are you sure you guys just don't want to sit around for another 2 hours and debate things?
Any other questions or comments? I know it's very long one. Marianne, do you have a question or comment?
It's just a comment about the last 2 days, if I may. Is that okay?
Sure.
We've spent almost 2 days together, and they've been very helpful. And I just want to thank the staff for providing all the information, giving the presentations, getting stakeholders to come together to give us this input, because this is a critical turning point juncture for the state of Indiana. I thought about ESSA in general, that we have an opportunity here to improve the culture and climate among the professionals across the state of Indiana. And that's really near and dear to me sitting on this board. And it'll go a long way for building trust if we roll it out right and if we really engage everyone wisely. Today we had a conversation about establishing values, and I strongly believe that starting with your values are going to give you the best decisions in making critical and sound decisions. And so hindsight being 2020, I do have a bit of a concern that perhaps in some of our stakeholder groups, we didn't start with our values. Now, we didn't have the opportunity to talk about them as a board, but I have some concern that we had stakeholder groups come together, they established their values for that working committee, and then they made recommendations that they know are recommendations, that the board will have that final decision, but to change a lot of what they are recommending without them knowing what our values were doesn't go a long way for the trust building that I was hoping to accomplish. And so I just have concern that we're constantly looking at what we're saying to these people from vast pieces of our educational profession across the state. When they come together, they work really hard for us to not quickly dismiss what they're recommending to us based upon values they didn't know we had. So thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
I'm sorry.
No, you can-
I'm sorry.
go.
To that, because I thought this was really good, or are you wanting more discussion
No,
on that?
I was just gonna close it out.
Okay. Could we entertain the idea of for next board meeting, because we've got to come back for, and I don't even know whether we can do this, so I'll start with this or comment, and then we'll figure out what we can do. Could we start with like a 2-hour working session before that, and then go into the meeting on some of these things, look at that data that we're talking about getting back? And does that make any sense to do something?
Yeah, we'll work with the board staff to come up with a work session that seems to make sense for everybody's schedules.
It seems to me the more important piece of that would be for it to be before the board meeting this next time with some of those issues. What's that? Right, absolutely, absolutely.
What are the possibilities of meeting the afternoon before the next board meeting?
Afternoon or evening before? We'll look at it. I think the
Or
board can
evening.
send out some information and we'll see where everybody's available.
Yeah, because I agree with Byron that we need time to digest this, and I think even, I agree with Byron, we need to digest it, have time to digest it, but I really worry about getting something at 9 and voting on something at 11.
Absolutely.
So if we could have even the evening to kind of talk it over an evening meal or something, but well stated.
Sure. So in closing, I just want to thank the board. I know the conversations were difficult. It's a complex issue. So I do appreciate your time. 2 days of your lives, and I know you're all busy, is truly, truly appreciated. And I hope this continues because I really think this is how we're going to get movement. So Marianne, I agree with your comments. To pay attention and listen to the field is vital. You cannot get anything done. Leaders can't lead without followers. And so we need to make sure that we are listening to the field and keeping our eye on the prize of what's best for kids. To the DOE staff and to the state board staff, thank you, because I know you put a lot of time into the last 2 days, and we do appreciate your work. And so with that, does the state board staff have anything else to add? Okay, we will close the work session. Thank you. See you tomorrow at 9.
Okay, good seeing you. Yeah, I got to run to a little. We'll see you.
Oh, okay. Well, I do have, I thought, is that meeting because I have assessment?